Hey, good morning, everyone, in History of the Constitution. I wanted to follow up on our First Amendment discussion um, from the previous video where I left off talking about basically freedom of speech, related very much to it, and the analysis is very similar as freedom of the press. But the one thing I didn't talk about with freedom of press, and I want you to know it, certainly going to be on the next quiz or a quiz, is this concept called prior restraint. What that means is if the press has information that it wants to disseminate, the government can't stop it unless it can prove that the disclosure of the information will cause harm to human life and safety. It's a very, very difficult standard for the government to prove. That doesn't mean the person that possesses the information might not be punished because they got that information illegally or violated some law to get that information. And the famous case comes, and I'm not going to burden you with reading it because we only have so much time left in the semester, is regarding the Pentagon Papers. And it was basically it was the United States versus the New York Times. And the New York Times wanted to print the Pentagon Papers, which were illegally obtained. These were secret government papers studying the success and failures of the Vietnam War. And the information in there was such that it was revealing that the Vietnam War was going very poorly. It wasn't going to be a success, and the tide wasn't turning, and the military made an assessment that things were going quite poorly and would likely not improve, and they didn't want that disseminated to the public. Would it be damaging to the public morale? Maybe. Would it be damaging to the war effort and the political ramifications for funding the war? Probably. But would human health and safety and lives of military staff and civilians be at risk as a result of the releasing of the Pentagon Papers? No. So under the concept of prior restraint, the New York Times could print those articles. Now, the guy's name was Daniel Ellsberg, could he be sanctioned for basically getting classified information and basically a larceny of documents? Yes, he could, and he was. It didn't go very far because of the nature of the ramifications in public sentiment. The government didn't go too far with that. So yeah, you could still be punished. But that doesn't mean the information can't be disseminated. And that's called, the concept is called prior restraint. If the government wants to stop the press or any individual, really, when we say press, we mean someone disseminating public information about things that are going on in our society. It doesn't have to be an organized news media outlet. The government can only do so if they can show this compelling human health and safety sort of aspect to the case, very rarely being able to get over that very, very difficult hurdle. And why? Think about it. Why did the framers do this? And why is the court interpreting that way? Because when things comment, especially on politics and civic life, it's the closest we come to an absolute right. We want that information disseminated so the public can be aware. And the press does keep us free in a lot of respects, or at least it used to. I like to think it still does, because it keeps the public informed what's going on. And so if the government were able to stop that, you could see it would put a chilling effect on it. So they should be able to stop it in the right circumstances. But what are those right circumstances? When people are going to be killed or injured, or property loss is going to happen as a result of that. For example, if I was working for the press, or I had a blog out there, and I knew the next military movement of the United States forces in Afghanistan might be from base A to base B, and I'm going to reveal that in my blog, could that make them subject to attacks by different terrorist groups within that country? Yeah, that would endanger human health and safety, so therefore they could stop me from disseminating that information ahead of time. But it's pretty rare, very heavy burden, and I think the courts get it right, and I think our constitutional framers got it right, because we want the public to know a certain level of transparency, but it's not perfect transparency. Sometimes the government does need to keep things secret in order to protect national security, but it's more rare than one might think, and the government tries to do it all the time. The perfect example where they try to do it was the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, where enemy combatants were housed, and they were taking pictures of these people in very compromising poses, and doing very, very degrading acts while naked and things like that. And the Pentagon, the government, tried to stop the dissemination of those photographs from being printed in the news media, suggesting it would somehow harm the cause and the effort that was going on in Iraq. and they couldn't substantiate it. There'd be no loss of life. The enemy's not going to fight us harder because of the release of that, but would it demoralize maybe our interest? Yeah, but the demoralization is not the standard. It's whether or not health and human safety is going to be put at immediate risk. And so those pictures did get disseminated. Now, someone who maybe got access to those pictures might be punished because the access was gained illegally, punished under the appropriate statutes. But that doesn't mean the information can be frozen by the government. It's very rare that the government can succeed in that. Related to that also is the freedom of, I should say related, but in that context, I want to talk about the amendment clearly talks about freedom of assembly and the right to petition the government. Those are very related. We can go out and protest. We can go out and petition the government. We can complain about the government and complain about our status and how we're treating the government without what? Without expectation of reprisal, because it's a right under the First Amendment. Didn't want to spend a ton of time on it, but it's very important in a society. We don't study it that much because it doesn't come up too much anymore in case law, except in those cases where the government says, we can control it in time, place, and manner. And sometimes they go a little bit overboard, and it causes what? A chilling effect. It basically curtails the right without justification by charging large fees for a parade or a protest, charging people the cost of police details that are exorbitant, not necessarily reasonable under the circumstances. Those kinds of things have often been challenged, usually successfully, saying the government is putting an undue burden on the First Amendment privilege you have to protest and petition the government for redress. And the government can't punish you for complaining. It's a beautiful thing. It's also sometimes, if we like what the government stance is on something and people are protesting, sometimes it gets us upset. But that's part of living in a dualist society where there's multiple interests and multiple parties and multiple philosophies going on, that someone who has different philosophies and views than I, and they're shouting out about them and protesting about them, that might get me upset. But we don't live in a homogenous society where we all agree on everything. If we did, we wouldn't be getting angry or upset. But the point is that we live in a civil society, and hopefully that anger is addressed through debate and discussion and voting, and not through violence. And for the most part, in the big picture, we've been pretty successful. Now we have to move on to religion. The amendment starts off with the religious clause. I should have probably did that video first, but it starts off, Congress shall pass no law establishing a religion, nor inhibiting the free exercise thereof. So one's called the Establishment Clause, and the other's the Free Exercise Clause. Let's start off with the Free Exercise Clause. Generally speaking, we are free because the government put right in the Constitution. We are free to believe whatever we want and exercise our religious faith, philosophy in any way we want. But like all rights, including freedom of speech, there are limitations. So I'm free to believe anything I want, but in the exercise of my religion, it could be curtailed if it's going to cause human health and safety. So, for example, say, well, geez, tonight, as part of my ceremony, my faith, I need to go out and sacrifice some human beings. Clearly, the government has a compelling interest to curtail that religious exercise, and therefore, I will be refrain from doing that, even if that's in my belief system. I'm allowed to believe it. I'm allowed to discuss it because of freedom of speech, but I'm not allowed to actually execute it. No pun intended, because execution equals death. But what's interesting, we get into a finer line where what if my religious faith, say I'm a Native American group and we've exercised our faith with the use of certain hallucinogenic herbs or teas or mushrooms or something like that, would that be protected? And the courts come about in a little bit of an inconsistent set of decisions on that. One group was allowed to use certain and later the Congress actually overrode the interpretation of that. But the point is those kinds of things are sometimes in conflict with our drug policy here. And the question is does the religious free exercise trump or prohibit the free exercise of the religion if it's been a long-standing practice? And it goes into a debate back and forth whether is the government's interest so compelling as opposed to the religious free exercise thereof. I'll put a couple cases up for you guys to review, put up some reviews from scholars about how far the free exercise goes. You're always free to believe what you want to believe, but it's the exercising of it that might curtail it. And sometimes when I taught this class in a traditional classroom, I talk about, well, how about, okay, we're going to bring a goat up to the altar today in my faith, and we're going to slaughter a lamb or a sheep or a goat or something like that. And I said, could the government ban that? And most students say yes, they could. And in fact, there's case law on that. It goes, no, because there's been a long history before the Constitution was actually created of many faiths that sacrificed animals. But what might they be prohibited from doing it? Sacrificing the animal in an unusually barbaric, cruel, and torturous way, as opposed to a traditional slaughtering of the animal for feast or for sacrifice. And so you see the balance here. It's a bit of a challenge, and cases come up quite often determining whether or not something can be prohibited by the government in terms of people's faith exercising. What's more difficult and what's more interesting, and it comes up quite a bit, is the Establishment Clause. And people say, well, we've had the history of the United States was founded on separation of church and state. It's actually incorrect. The founding of the colonies were based in significant part on religious practices. In fact, many of the communities in New England, Massachusetts being one of them, you actually had to be a member of the Puritan faith to participate in civic life, to seek office, or to participate in leadership, or to vote. And that was an evolution that came later, really almost at the advent of the Revolutionary War, where we started to recognize, because there were more faiths within the country, and because some people, especially with the Age of Enlightenment, taking over some of the views of our political leaders, saying we really have to have a distinction between people going out and exercising their faith and requiring it of the government to sponsor it. In fact, early on in our colonial history, the government's taxes would often be earmarked, a significant amount of it would be earmarked towards the different churches and church needs and practices and protocols that we decided to break away from. It started well, some people can say it started in Rhode Island, Roger Williams, but officially it started with Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, where they came out with a specific mandate basically saying the government will not recognize a faith as an official faith, and people are to be able to freely exercise their own faith in their own terms and their own ways in which they wish to do so. But now, in terms of, after the Revolutionary War and shortly thereafter, we've had a very strident attempt to keep church separated, or faith separated from official policy. But what does that exactly mean? Can there be none of it all? And I thought I had a dollar bill here on my desk, but I had a quarter here a second ago. But what does it say on most of our monies? In God we trust. Many of you went to public school. I went to public school. What did I do at public school? I did something called the Pledge of Allegiance, and during that pledge I said, under God. When I took the oath as an attorney, I promised to uphold the Constitution of both Massachusetts and the federal government under God. When I go to court and witnesses get sworn in to testify, what is swearing in? It's swearing that they'll face so help me God. I mean, God will punish you if you potentially lie. So to say there's this thick wall of separation of all religious recognition and government functioning would be invalid. And so how far can it overlap? What can it be done? And there's different things that have happened over time, and it's the courts that tell us. To establish a faith usually requires some kind of financial and or promotion by the government to violate that clause. So is it legal to put what we call a creche scene, a nativity scene on a town common during what we consider the Christian Christmas season, if you will? No, it's not, even though it's on public land. Why? Because as long as they don't discriminate against other faiths, the public forums can be used by faith groups just as equally as some secular group like the Optimist Club can use those same territories, as long as you don't discriminate from one faith over another. But there comes a time where the government says, we have computers that we're going to distribute to the public school, but we're going to give some to the local parochial school too, because those are our citizens as well. Does that, and that's the famous case, the Lemon case, does that violate the Establishment Clause because it's giving financial support or resources to a faith, and therefore they can go out and proselytize, promote their faith more with the financial resources they save? It's not an easy analysis. Things like, if you're going to public forums, sometimes there's a cross as part of a Christian crucifix, as part of a statute or a part of a public display, does that violate? Having a Christmas play that references the birth of Jesus Christ in a public school, does that violate the Establishment Clause? And the answer is not very easy. It's a complex test, and the one we still pretty much use, although the court may be changing that somewhat in the future, is called the Lemon test. And why is it called the Lemon test? It comes from a famous case. And let me just read you the test. It's a 3-pronged test, not easy to apply. We can debate how it gets applied. So it depends on who the current justices are when they applied this standard, determine whether or not we have violated what we consider to be the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And so here it is. First, the statute must have, this is in order to survive it, meaning that the action of the government will withstand a challenge. Like, hey, it's okay. You're not going too far in the establishment of a official religious program, if you will. The first test is the statute must have a secular purpose, meaning that what they're doing isn't designed to promote a religion. It's just designed to benefit society in some way and just happens to overlap with a religious organization in some fashion. Second, its principal or primary effect must be one that neither advances nor inhibits religion. And third, and this is the one that the court mostly grapples with, the statute, okay, now of course there's an ad right in the middle of the rule. Finally, the statute must not foster an excessive government entanglement with the religion. It must not be so much working with a faith to really be giving that faith an advantage or a detriment, as opposed to all other faiths, or non-faith to those who are non-believers at all. And so it's a fine line. And for the most part, most people celebrate this, but it comes up in our culture all the time. What do I mean all the time? I'm a kind of a John F. Kennedy. I'm not a historian, really. Well, I guess I am in a way, but I mean, I follow the Kennedy history, and one of the things that was really interesting when he was running for president in 1960, there was a lot of concern over his Catholicism, being a Catholic. And you think, okay, after that, he won the election, maybe that's it, and we weren't going to have these. We still have these issues. When Mitt Romney ran, people brought up the fact that he was a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, some people call Mormons, and people talked about his faith and whether that should preclude him from being the president of the United States. And then most recently, I believe her name is Amy Barrett, became the member of the Supreme Court. She is a Catholic, and I think she's also involved in a certain sect of the faith. I'm not sure, but people were bringing it up as a big important issue. And her point is she's not going to let her faith interfere with her views on the court, because some people are really interpret the separation of church and state very strictly. Others are more liberal, recognizing there's a cultural history and there's an ability for both faith and government to coexist on some level. It just can't go too far. How do we know when it goes too far? It's whether or not this Lemon test has been violated. A former faculty member at the Mount, I'm not going to say her name, but she was a nun, actually, before she became a professor at the Mount. She's now since retired, a good friend of mine, and I used to sit with her oftentimes at graduation. And those of you that go to graduation of the Mount, guess what's going to happen at the end? There's going to be some local minister. I believe she's a minister of a Unitarian church, which is very broad, but it's still a faith-based organization. She gives what we call the convocation. She comes up and says a prayer, and it's a very innocuous prayer. It probably is appropriate for many different faiths, but not all, and certainly not those people who are agnostic or non-believers. But one year, after tensions that were arising between Muslim groups and other groups in the United States, somebody at the college wanted to send a message of unity. So they not only had her speak, the Unitarian minister, but they had a priest, they had a minister, they had a pastor, they had a cleric from the Muslim faith, they had a rabbi come and speak to show a sense of, shared value. But all these people were doing prayers, and I remember the former nun sitting next to me. He goes, Corman, isn't this a violation of the Establishment Clause? I feel like I'm at a religious revival for about 10 different faiths. And what about the faiths they didn't include? There's no Taoist up there. There's no Hindu speaker. There's no, and I hate to say I know all the faiths. I don't know them all. But you get my point, right? We're at a state institution, and all these prayers are being said. Did it cross the line? It may have. I don't know. Because there have been cases there's one out of Texas where a prayer that was done before the football game at a public institution was kind of, they expected everyone in the stands to stand up and pray. That was deemed to violate the Establishment Clause. It went too far. The state government was involved a little bit too far in promoting a Christian ideological prayer at the football games, and that got banned for the future use of the things. But I don't want you to mix this up. Now, what if there's a Christian group at the Mount that wants to start a club? Could they use one of the classrooms during community time in order to promote their club? Yes, they could, because it's not the college promoting it. It's allowing it just like any other club, or the legal studies club, or the travel club, or the French club, or the music club. They can't be denied, because if you're denied, now what are you doing? You're interfering with the free exercise clause. So it's a real tricky balance here. And most of the time, I think we've crafted a situation where it works. But some people get very upset. I have some very religious friends, and some of them say, what's going wrong with society is we don't allow prayer in school anymore. Well, we allow it privately. You're free to pray in your own time silently, but it can't be promoted by the school. You can't have a teacher go up in the beginning of class. And I went through this as a student when I was a kid in school. I can remember in public school saying a prayer very early on, but I remember it changing during that time, and it went from a prayer to what we call a moment of silence. And you could meditate, reflect on your day, or pray. Just can't do it out loud. And so it was trying to dance around this concept of a public school establishing religious protocol. It's not that easy. And we've had cases, one was right out of here in Massachusetts, trying to take out the Pledge of Allegiance where you say under God. And the court said, no, it doesn't go that far to violate the Establishment Clause, because students aren't required to participate. And it's kind of a non-faith identity. But, I was thinking, well, what if you have no faith at all and you don't want to hear about God because you're an agnostic or an atheist? And they say, well, you can go outside the room or you can remain silent. But that does that maybe stigmatize you? It was an interesting question. And some of the judges said, yeah, it should be removed. And it's not, because it's part of our cultural and historical patterns we have in our country, and it doesn't go too far. So that's the kind of question. Does it go too far? And you kind of know it when you see it, and it's up to the courts. And that's why it's so important to understand Marbury versus Madison. The courts determine when we go too far in violating either the free exercise clause or the Establishment Clause. And we debate about it all the time. I know many people want to have that very thick wall between government and religion, and others people recognize that there's a historical and cultural overlap between religious faiths and community activity. Just how far can it go before it becomes unpalatable or unacceptable? And that's where the courts tell us where it stands. And many people argue about this is a big issue with a lot of politicians, and many different people, either of faith or of another faith, that think that they're getting sort of shortchanged in terms of government promotion and or protections. Other than that, I'll put up a couple of cases. I want you to read another assignment, and I'll make it do with the rest. We'll get the First Amendment kind of wrapped up, and then we'll jump into the Fourth. But don't be, it's a huge, we could have a whole class just on the First Amendment. I'm trying to get that big nugget kind of concepts about freedom of speech and how far it can go, freedom of the press, which is very related to that, freedom of assembly and the petition to government, but then the free exercise and the Establishment Clause. As long as you know the basic concepts, that's fantastic, because there's a lot of stuff in the Constitution that you could just focus on one aspect of it and have a whole class. Otherwise, be well, stay in touch.